For many people, it's hard to have a discussion about language, power or politics without mentioning George Orwell. He was born in India, but raised in England. In the 1940s, he produced two of what many people think are the greatest novels of the 20th century, Animal Farm and 1984. Then he died of tuberculosis, aged 46. Despite Orwell's request that there should be no biography, there have been countless attempts to pin down this most elusive of writers. 100 years after his birth, we commissioned his latest biographer, D.J. Taylor, to look for the real George Orwell.
This is one man's alarmed vision of the future. A future which he felt might, with such dangerous ease, be brought about.
George Orwell is one of those writers, there are perhaps 2 or 3 in any century, who managed to colonize the popular consciousness of their time. Like Dickens and Shakespeare, the phrases he contributed to the language are known to millions of people who've never read a line of his books. Big Brother is watching you, Room 101. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. In the half-century since his death, he's become, well, a piece of moral litmus paper. The writer to whom we turn to explain events that he seems almost to have predicted. Among the millions of words written in the aftermath of 9/11, it was curious how many people asked the same question. What would George have thought? But just as important is the question of how George thought. And this is a journey into the heart of Orwell's imagination.
What I've most wanted to do is to make political writing into an art. My starting point is always a feeling of partisanship, a sense of injustice. When I sit down to write a book, I do not say to myself, I'm going to produce a work of art. I write it because there is some lie that I want to expose, some fact to which I want to draw attention, and my initial concern is to get a hearing.
All of Orwell's admirers from time to time indulge in the hopeless task of wondering what he might have thought or how he might have written about contemporary issues. It's very tempting. We can't know. His strength was that he had no party line, only that searing eye for cant, for phoniness, for bogus arguments. And we can't know what Orwell might have said about the war, because he wasn't a pacifist. Freeing the Iraqis from Saddam's oppression might have been his option. Who knows? I happen to think that it almost certainly would not have been, not in this case.
Orwell has always appealed to people on the right because although he defined himself as a man of the left, he spent most of his life criticizing people on the left. But at the same time, because he identified himself as a man of the left also claims him.
If you're a political writer and you ever feel jaded or uninspired, the thing to do is sit down, perfect cure, and read some Orwell, and he'll remind you why you got into this in the first place. He inspired us to think that political writing was something worth doing, and thank you very much.
Whatever the political arguments about Orwell, one thing is for certain. His name was actually Eric Arthur Blair. Even this change of name says something about the myths he created around himself. And one of the tantalizing things for the biographer is his sheer elusiveness. The real Orwell is simply very hard to track down. It's fascinating that all this stuff's now turning up in the Soviet archives. Presumably somewhere there in the old NKVD archive is the papers that they took from him in Spain in 1937.
I'm sure they are. No one ever has managed to get hold of what is in that file. I'm sure it exists, and I'm sure, like many things, there'll be quite a lot more things will turn up, not only in Russia. I think anyone trying to do a new biography of Orwell is facing appalling challenges, really, and I certainly didn't envy David Taylor when he started on this quest 2 or 3 years ago. There have been several biographies. There have been all sorts of peripheral books describing things in his life, describing his work, dozens and dozens of articles. So it's a mammoth task, I think.
You spent years tracking him through Caversham and the BBC archives and there, but you never, I mean, as far as we know, there is no extant recording of his voice. Did you ever get on the trail of that? Did you?
He did quite a few recordings for programmes, but none has ever turned up with his voice. So
we live in hope that
we live in
somewhere
hope,
there's
yes,
going to be...
that this cracked voice will appear.
So how do we discover what he sounded like, how he behaved? As Orwell famously remarked in 1984, if there's hope, it lies in the proles. But Orwell wasn't a prole. He was the son of an upper-middle-class civil servant, steeped in the traditions of empire and duty, and his occasional attempts to disguise himself nearly always came to grief.
I always thought, in the rather brief time I knew him, though I saw a certain amount of him before I ever spoke to him, he was, I thought, a rather forbidding character. He would never say, let's go and have a drink, always have a pint, which he seemed to think having a pint was sort of good working class vernacular, which I dare say it was. But at one time, I was in a pub in Fleet Street, and he said, you know, if you talk in that sort of voice, he very much disliked my voice, no doubt with good reason, and wear that sort of tie, you'll never get yourself accepted as working class. Now, this absolutely outraged me, because I didn't want to be accepted as any class. I was me, and that was that. But what irritated him was that the barman continually addressed him as sir, and always called me Peter. Well, that was the sort of thing which Orwell disliked.
A pint of wallop.
You know, Jim?
In a prole sector, we don't get it here.